to Aim4Truth, the radio network for the anonymous patriots and the American intelligence media. I am your host, Thomas Paine, and today my guest, John Barnwell, and I will be speaking about a most amazing thing called the diabolical secrets of the far left, as they're now called the far left. I'm going to do a little introduction on this, and then I'm really interested in today's broadcast because I want to see and hear what it is that John has to say about this, because he studied these things somewhat like a political scientist, much more than myself and others in our group have studied it. So it'll be interesting to get his perspective on this, particularly in relationship to the fact that what we would call the far left, the radical left now, is embodied in Antifa, who recently went out onto the streets in Kansas City with full-on automatic weapons, rifles slung over their shoulders, and when asked if they had a carry permit, they said no. They thought that that was okay. They should just be able to take their weapons out into the street and go ahead and riot anytime they want, seeing that after Charlottesville, it was turned into such a fiasco that somehow the people who went out on the streets without the permit, with bats in their hand and gas masks covering their face, all ready for a riot, they were in fact never really looked at by the mainstream media or anyone else. As a matter of fact, Trump got in trouble for even not condemning them and saying that both sides of the right, both the left and right, the extreme radical left, the extreme radical right, are both equally at fault. And in that particular situation, we know that to be true. So I'm going to put this in perspective. When I think of the left, I think back to before the French Revolution, when the King of France would join the three estates together in the Estates General, and on the left-hand side would be the third estate. That's us. Those are the common folk. We got a vote, but then there were two other votes, and that was the clergy and the monarchy, and the clergy being the first estate, because, of course, God and God's church on earth was in power. They were the ones who told the king that he had divine right to rule. So the second estate was the monarchy and the nobles and what we would now call the elite, the corporate elite, basically, essentially. And so I see it pretty clear that the left, which is where the name came from, when you sat to the left of the king at the Estates General, you were called the left. Now it's the left wing in politics, but it's what we would now associate with the Democrats per se, though that's going to be contested here in this conversation today, that's for sure. But the extreme left now, everyone has been awakened to that, and I myself was never really awakened to the roots of some of what we would call the diabolical, Diablo, the devil, some of the devil worship aspects, and some of the very, very horrible secret aspects of the hidden side of the radical left, which we'll hear about today. So I also want to bring in mind that not only is the church the first estate, and the elite is the second estate, and the common people are the third estate, there's also the fourth estate, and that's basically the media. The media was always entrusted, or the fourth estate was entrusted with finding out the truth, basically what we call intelligence here, getting the truth, getting the intelligence, and giving it to those three estates so that they could make informed decisions. Well, the church always had its own intelligence. The monarchy had its own intelligence, but what they told the common people is basically what the fourth estate was there, was to try to wake up the common people so that when tyranny did take control of a country, that the common people would rise up against it. Not necessarily in the way that it often turns out, like in the French Revolution, where it turns into sheer anarchy, mayhem, murder, and absolute out-of-control insanity, basically a civil war type situation, which we see again and again when we overthrow elected officials in countries in even today's modern geopolitical setting. So the church was supposed to, in the past, represent the freedom of the individual, was supposed to be watching out for the individual, was supposed to be connecting the individual to the divine. But now the church really is more of a socialist, Marxist, almost communism coming out of the Roman Church and Francis, stating there should be no borders, stating that the Jesuit liberation theology that he believes in, which is basically a socialism or a social Marxism bordering on communism, is what he wants for the world. And he's using his religious position to try to take away human freedom, particularly in countries that don't want open borders. So when I look at this, the part I don't understand is I can understand how the second estate, the monarchy, the royalty, the oligarchs, these corporate imperialists, these banker brokers, as we call them, these warlords who control the third estate, I can see how they go crazy and become sociopaths. They get absolute power sometimes and they go completely nuts. One might be very good, but the one that comes after them is horrible. But what I don't understand is how did that go from the second estate, which oftentimes is called the Republican, basically is where we see the Republican is on the right side. How did that go from the oligarchs, this horrible, horrible obsession with power? How did that drift over into what we now call really democracy or liberal democracy, or what the progress for the paradox of progress, which the 17 members of the intelligence community put out, said that if populism and nationalism wasn't going to win in the last presidential election, it would have to be the attempt of the Democratic Party to go completely to the far radical left and become basically socialists. And as we know, there's no effective socialist, completely socialist country in the world, never has been. So why is it that what I would call the third estate or the left wing, why has it become such a major deal that the Democrats, who supposedly represent them, have become involved in so much pedophilia, in so much corruption, in the Jeffrey Epstein Island that they all go to, so that it's practically stuck in your face, the pedophilia, all the different politicians recently elected, and the greatest amount of pedophiles ever arrested since the time that Ivanka Trump started a office in the West Wing to look for this human trafficking, to look for this type of evil. And what did she find? She found more criminals than imaginable, and all the way up through the government. Some say that the ring is tightening on Washington, D.C., and that eventually we'll be looking at the pedophiles. But I think of England, where it all started to come out, and it went straight to the top. It went straight to the monarchy. And so they made a rule. No more. You cannot look into pedophilia anymore in relationship to members of parliament. That's their new law. Are we going to have a law like that that allows the lawlessness of the Obama administration and also the Bush and the Clinton and all the way back to when the White House started to become basically a terrorist organization for their own separate greed and working with all the different agencies they had to support them? So would we see Obama comes in, he's definitely as liberal and left as he could possibly be. And we see that now in his resistance movement against trying to overthrow the government, basically, by putting 32,000 foot soldiers out on the street. So why is it that we see that the left has become equally as evil as the right? We know that the monarchy has always done horrible things in history in terms of pedophilia and torture and war and killing people. Why has that spread to the left? And so, John, that's my question for you today, because that's really all I had to say about this issue, because it is disturbing to me, and I don't understand how it has shifted back and forth and how the lie has been so pervasive that entire blocks of the American people vote Democratic just because they believe that is the moral right thing to do, because of, the social equality, the egalitarianism, the social justice, the civil rights, all the different beleaguered, unrepresented groups are supposedly represented by the Democrats. Then why is it that they are the ones, like Hillary Clinton, who rips off the people who gave to her foundation and ripped off the people of Haiti? And the crimes against the Clintons are too long for us to enumerate, but they're a perfect example. Why is it that the left tends to go so absolutely sociopathic and crazy into the diabolical secrets that are now coming out, John?
Well, that was quite a mouthful. It's not much fun digging into some of this area of research, but it really can't be avoided. It's part of the unfortunate turn of the modern world. But really, it's something that if one begins to research it, it's really not merely an attribute of postmodernism. It's something that extends all the way back. And so that it's something that it's a continuation of a state of affairs that pre-existed Christianity. You can go all the way back to ancient Sumer, and you find in Sumeria that it was standard for a woman to go into the temple and be a temple prostitute. And if she were to marry, it was because somebody came and saw her in the temple and decided she was the one and picked her as a wife, which to us is like unbelievably strange, but yet that was normative in that particular culture at that time. In looking at our current oligarchic system, we can trace this back through the corporate system of England, the British Empire. And we see the East India Trading Company and the Dutch East India Trading Company, because there was such an alliance between Holland and England through the overturning of the English king and bringing in a Dutch king. But these corporate entities were involved in all manner of things. And in fact, Harvard University itself, the largest endowed university, largest endowment, the foundation of that endowment was money that was received from the slave trade and from the opium trade. So this is something that's plagued civilization. And really, we have England and America also to thank for the elimination of slavery. But we've yet to see elimination of the opium trade, so that you see that 10% of the opium trade came out of Afghanistan until we began operations there, and now it's responsible for 80 or 90% of the opium trade. So it's another unfortunate attribute. As to how this would come to be something that's so pervasive in government, at one time in our government, it was sufficient to get some photographs, of, say, a senator with another woman, and you could blackmail the senator. But these days, that's not a big deal. People don't really care so much about that. So if you want to blackmail somebody, you're going to have to catch them doing something worse than that, which is, pictures of them with a 12-year-old or something of that nature. If they won't go along to it, it's possible to drug them and stick them in a bed with a 12-year-old and get the photographs, and they'd have some explaining to do, even though they weren't guilty. This is involving people that couldn't be bought off per se, so that the wheels of Washington are greased through greed, corruption, blackmail, and all these sorts of unfortunate things. And so in looking at the Democratic Party, in particular, to your question, I think that gives us some understanding of how this could become so prevalent. But to try and characterize them as the party of civil rights and all of that that's entirely incorrect, seeing as how the KKK was basically the militant wing of the Democratic Party, and it was the Republican Party. It was the civil rights passing of bills began with the Republican President Eisenhower. So that really it's out of the Republican Party. Abraham Lincoln was Republican. That was the beginning of the Republican Party. It was the anti-slavery party. But to get into this, I think that unless you have some other terms that you'd like to get to.
Well, that's very insightful that this has been happening for such a long time. And as you mentioned it, perhaps even having some of its genesis in Sumer and Sumeria. Well, it's that Sumerian owl that they worship in these ceremonies in the Bohemian Grove, as well as they get to observe a human sacrifice. Now, human sacrifice has always been at the heart of many of the mysteries. For instance, ancient Egyptian mysteries, Greek mysteries, but particularly on into modern day with Masonry. So you have really some death mysteries involved there, but those were supposed to be finding out that there's life beyond death, not that death, in fact, has an element of fear, control, alarm, or manipulation, or in many cases that people die. They die because the President of the United States decides to bomb their country for no good reason whatsoever, except some imaginary intelligence that he has, and doesn't even have to ask the Congress. So these are diabolical crimes on a huge level, and we know that in the past, the oligarchy, the monarchy, would order a war that would cause the death of huge amounts of people, death all over the place. We know that the Catholic Church was responsible for just an untold amount of deaths, of whether it was the witches and stealing their property, which is really the auspices of what half of the rich condemnations were for, and the death of all these witches. But beyond that, marching people into the ocean, and we kill you or you get baptized. So we've seen this over and over and over again, and it's about freedom, it seems to me. And it's about finding out that you aren't really going to die at death, but that you have life after that. If you had that, then that first estate of the church you would take into your own control, and you'd start to realize that you have freedom. So in America, it looks like we have freedom. We get to choose between the parties, but really, there's only one party. You can break it down to how many people in either of the party happens to be a globalist or a nationalist, and basically the way I break it down is it's not really centralized evil control. That's why it keeps proliferating and is so ubiquitous, is because evil is everywhere, because the people in the bureaucracy, the people in the permanent government, as it's being called now, the people who are in the deep state, who are making the decisions in contradistinction to Trump and his team, or anybody else who happens to be a temporary appointment, these are the people who are working out of their own personal self-greed. And so I can see that if you climb the ladder and you start to have power, that you can take a trip to Jeffrey Epstein's island and have any kind of perversion that you want. Nothing is illegal there. And that you go there 27 times because you're Bill Clinton. Or you go there as Hillary Clinton for whatever she went there for. Or as you go, when you start to have strange, or let's remember, that's where Obama went. When Obama, stopped being president, he went to Fiji for a while. Then he went to Jeffrey Epstein's island. Then he went on a boat. I think it was Geffen's boat. We're talking about horrible, sensational hedonism and personal self-gratification beyond levels that the commoners in the third estate would really understand, because we're not the elite. We aren't the ones who, like you say, the British East India Company brought us drugs. The Dutch East India Company brought us slaves. So the burden of slavery was really upon the Europeans using America as a place to farm what it is that they wanted to farm outside of their country, so that they wouldn't be held culpable for it. So we see that happening when people get into power. But we also know that it's both sides of the aisle. It isn't just that the Democrats are evil. But John, why do you think that? Because I don't believe this theory that if you go so far to the right and you're extreme radical right, then you're a fascist. I don't think that's true, and I think you don't think that's true either. But if you go extremely to the left and you're a radical, which now seems to be the largest part of the spectrum, that's all okay, because no matter what your cause is, it's okay, because everybody gets represented on the far left. But on the far right, I don't think that it really is fascism, because fascism to me is a little bit different than taking that, what was called the second estate, or the way that I characterize this in my extremely loose metaphor. I don't think that that's quite the way that it works, that if you go so far to the right that you actually reach fascism. I think that the oligarchs, unfortunately, when they dip into capitalism, like we've seen so much in the satellite countries of the former USSR, that you see that the ones who fail, like a Yeltsin, or like the current president of Ukraine, or the current president of Kazakhstan, they're faced with gigantic choices of good and evil. And as they do, you can actually see some of them go completely mad, completely insane with their choices. But with others, you can see that they take the right steps. So how is it, John, that the radical right is so easily characterized as fascism?
Well, that's easy. It's essentially an improper way to describe it. It's been used as a terminology to try and create kind of a false dichotomy. They're working with a Hegelian dialectic where you have thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. That's the methodology of the political class, that they try and create problem, reaction, solution. And they keep churning the environment of the populace back and forth, and they can keep them within a contained sphere of awareness. And so you say, okay, well, the left's had their turn, now the country's turning more to the right, and all of that. And that's a characterization that's only true insofar as it's been used for a long time. But really, if you look again, as I covered pretty succinctly in the most recent podcast of regarding liberty and conscience versus the institutional left, in that the real dichotomy is between authoritarianism and the individual sovereignty. And so that's the way it should really be characterized, because if you look at what we have today is essentially, because of all the lobbyists and the power of the corporations, we have a quasi-oligarchic system. And so the corporations kind of have a free rein, and things they can't get away with here, they go and set up factories in China or what have you, where they can have people work under basic slave circumstances, like a large corporation like Apple does. So that consequently, it becomes a question of seeing the populace as a resource. And that's the way they look at the third estate. And it's essentially a very twisted view that has come in through what you might call antinomian. And the antinomian impulse is essentially come out of, it's perceived as coming out of a secularism that happened during the French Revolution. Mind you, the United States was created and inspired by events that led up to the French Revolution. There were very good ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity involved in the French Revolution. But as it went into its more accelerated phase, there were the Montagne, which was the movement that was represented by Robespierre. And so you have the reign of terror, and thousands of people were beheaded, and anybody that was their opponent would go to the guillotine, and it just absolute mayhem occurred. And you have to look at that and say, you know, what could be behind this? And really this antinomian impulse is in the West, rooted in what's called Sabbatianism. That relates to an individual who was born in Turkey and in 1666 declared himself the Messiah. He was a rabbi who, Sabbatai Zevi, or Sabbatai Si, he was a Rebbe who said that the world is in a question of balance, and that there's good and there's evil, and that in order for the Messiah to come, the days of redemption to come, that we have to either all be all good or all evil. And he said, because people aren't capable of being good, then there's the active pursuit of evil. And so they took all of the observances of Judaism and they inverted them. So they were having all kinds of orgies, and they would consciously, ritualistically violate the rules of Judaism. Ultimately, the Sabbateans movement grew out of the terrible pogrom that was waged against them in the 17th century by the Cossacks, where there was just thousands upon thousands of people killed in the vicinity of Poland and the Ukraine, and people were looking that there must be something, and Sabbatai Zevi came along, and he ended up, they estimate he had as many as 1 million followers. But he was in Salonika in Turkey. But what happened was the ruler of Turkey told him that he had to convert to Islam or he would be beheaded, so he converted to Islam. And later he converted back. And so there's the Sabbatean movement within Turkey called the Donma, which is really the political class in Turkey. And the secular Turkish state grew out of that class. Now, there's all different grades of people involved in this, all the way from people that are kind of live and let live, all the way up to the very, very dark satanic brand of this that came out after the one individual in Poland, Jakob Frank, or Jacob Frank, who lived from 1726 to 1791. And he said that he could liberate the sparks of holiness through evil acts. And that's when it really became accelerated and started getting into just absolutely perverted human sacrifice and rituals and things like that, things of which people may have heard of from the decadent Mexican mysteries. In the decadent phase of the Druid mysteries, they had the Wicker Man, where they would sacrifice people in the Wicker Towers. The Vikings, they had this element. In Eastern Germany, just a few hundred years ago, they would sacrifice horses and drink horses' blood, and the mead of the Vikings was basically the most common form of it was fermented sheep's blood. So there's this whole blood path that is tied into this, and it's a very real thing. And recently there was a video on YouTube of a Dutch banker where he detailed how he became a banker and he got invited to parties and he thought, oh, that's kind of cool. They got naked women walking around and this and that. And he would go to these parties and he was kind of just a guy that, what guy doesn't like naked women, but as time went by, eventually they told him that he had to participate. If he wanted to move up in the company, he had to participate in a child sacrifice. So it absolutely, it just terrified him, obviously. And there's been numerous reports of things like that, but they don't get much press. We know that there's been more than 2,000 pedophilia arrests since President Trump came into office. Just recently, the mayor of Seattle stepped down after the 5th person came forward accusing him of pedophilia. We also have the former Speaker of the House, Dennis Hastert. He was the longest serving Speaker of the House in Congress. And he had to step aside because of his pedophilia. So this is far more widespread than people would have us believe. And in fact, there's movements, especially in England, there's actually a political movement to try and lower the age of consent to 10 years of age. Now, I heard they're compromising on this and trying to get it legalized at age 14. So you see that what you have here is this moral relativism that, well, things that the church says are evil, well, they're not really evil. That's just something that the church came up with, that these things are just relative, and trying to justify all of these kinds of acts. And, people are looking at some, like the whole thing that came up about the transsexual bathrooms. It's like there was nobody even asking for that. That just kind of popped up all of a sudden out of nowhere. Like who's involved in bringing these things forward? It isn't, the people that were in the gay community. Many of them were like absolutely shocked, because they said, we weren't even asking for this. It just kind of came out. So there's so many rabbit holes we can go down here. I'm not sure exactly which one you want to go down. It's kind of the kind of thing that I don't enjoy talking about, but I'm more than willing to share about it. And it's something that I've been aware of, and started studying. Really, the books of Gershom Schlom covers the history of Sabbatai Zevi. He's one of the most respected Judaic scholars. And you have to keep in mind here, I'm talking about facts. These are not conspiracy theories. There's a very, very strong factual basis behind this. And so you can see this Sabbatean movement tied into the Labor Zionist Party in Germany, for example. There were all of these Jewish organizations in Germany, and the Labor Zionists were able to cut a deal with the Nazis, and then there was only one Jewish organization. It was the Labor Zionist Party, and they made a document called the Transfer Agreement that had to do with trying to move Jews to Israel. And there's a very, very dark history there involving that branch of the Zionists. And again, you have to be careful with this stuff, because that doesn't mean all Zionists are like that, because they're not. That's just like one group of people working within that movement. And so it's very troubling studying these things.
Well, laying it out in a historical perspective really puts it into a better view, because when you realize that only 4,000 years ago human sacrifice was part of religious practice, or when you look at the fact that, as I said before, the Catholic Church has been responsible for how many millions of people's death, or look at the Nazis in World War II and the death of 6 million Jews and others. What we're looking at here is a long history of watching monarchies, as well as the church, kill huge amounts of people under the name of God. So what I wonder is, when you're a George Bush and you lie and come up with, and George Bush Sr. and George Bush Jr., and you lie and say that a country, is really harming us and we need to go bomb their people, and you kill hundreds of thousands of people, or like an Obama and a Hillary Clinton, who literally responsible for bombing and killing 2 million people, putting 55 million refugees into homeless status, and basically creating the migration that is taking over Europe as a new type of reverse crusade. When you're those people, are you making a deal with the devil? Or are you like the Catholic Church, who thinks that you're actually doing God's will, or the monarchy that thinks that they're defending their national rights, and that the blood that runs through their veins is better than the blood of the veins of commoners, because the Catholic Church has sanctioned them as the voice of God, as the rightful rulers of the earth? When you are a person that is responsible, like a Susan Rice, for killing 4.5 million people, what is going through your mind? Have you made a deal with the devil? Are they unconscious tools? I mean, we see, as you've pointed out, and I've pointed out throughout history, this has been happening on and on and on. It's almost common. We almost shouldn't be shocked at all to find out that this is going on. And let me just quote one statistic. Washington, D.C. is responsible for the following. Over 600,000 people are missing every year in America. Only about 10 to 20,000 of them are ever found, and it's not because the government helps find them, because there really is no way, unless the FBI gets called into a case, that they care about anybody coming up missing. So 600,000 people, That's human trafficking. That is conscious or unconscious human trafficking. Where do those people go? And why does the federal government not care whatsoever? And why is the Catholic Church so connected to so many of those missing people who came up missing while under the care of the Catholic Church services, whether it be social services, refugee services, foster care services, all kinds of services that they create? 189 different Catholic services deal with these type of people, and that's where these people come up missing from. So is it just that I am just so naive that I can't imagine ever being part of going to a Washington, D.C. snuff party or Bohemian Grove human sacrifice party where they think that that's something funny and that's how they get their power? I mean, that's what some of these people believe. They actually literally say that they worship Satan, and that's where they get their power, and their power comes by scaring people, by having power and control over people. With like an Obama, I mean, he must be a sociopath. How could he have bombed 7 countries ruthlessly and not had a reason to bomb any of them and didn't ask the American people? And how could the Congress allow that to happen, except for a Rand Paul who stood up and said this is all illegal? How can this be still going on to our age? We think we're civilized, but it seems as if we're no more civilized than the headhunters who have to go, count coup and take a head from the neighboring tribes so that they can build a house because they need a shrunken head of one of their neighbors who they ate to, put in at the base of the pole to create a new house for the community. And this can't stop. They can't stop this going on, no matter what they do, because these are traditions built into people. John, are we so conditioned by Diablo, by the devil, by the church and the teachings of the church, by the teachings of the monarchs, by the twisted teachings of the far left, that this is okay, that we should just wipe this out of our minds, that 600,000 people come up missing in America every year and no one does anything about it? How is that even humanly possible to me until I researched these things and found out that these are not exaggerations at all, folks? Go look into it, read our articles, Anonymous Patriots. We'll give you the statistics, but like John has pointed out, this is sad stuff to think about. And then to think that the Catholic Church is still involved in this, we're thinking that then the refugees, these migrants who came into Europe, and all that's going on, and all the suffering that has happened with all those people, and the Pope never once said, "Shame on you, Barack Hussein Obama, for bombing these countries." Did you ever hear the Catholic Church say, "Don't do that"? No, but the Catholic Church preaches every day, open all your borders, except the borders of the Vatican City. Open all your borders and accept all refugees or you're not a Christian. Well, wait a second. He is complicit with these crimes. So how does he have any moral dignity to tell us, or moral authority to tell others what to believe? We are in an age of socialism wiping out deals with the devil, as far as I can tell. Am I missing the point on this, John?
It's difficult dealing in this. There is a gentleman, Dr. Rabbi Marvin Entelman, and he wrote a 2-volume set to eliminate the opiate. And it's a study, Sabbatean, the history of Sabbatianism and how it has permeated. See, the way it works basically is that there are these venerable institutions, and the Sabbatian servants, the satanic streams, infiltrate these organizations and they pervert them. If they can go in and they can take something that's venerable and then pervert it to evil, then it's like a greater conquest. And so you see that the Freemasonry that gets blamed for so many things, it wasn't until it was infiltrated by the Sabbatian Frankists that certain streams of Freemasonry were perverted from the original venerable path that it was. It was a genuine spiritual path that was meant to carry the cultural richness of Christian Europe. And you have the various orders of chivalry that are all attached to the church, and some of them had become perverted from their original intentions. You see that you have these noble houses. At various times, I was in association with groups of houses of nobility because of certain connections within my own family, and I would encounter people, and in various groups online and so forth. So I came in contact with a great many people, many nice people, but some people you kind of wonder what's up with that, because you start to hear them lauding the writings of someone like Aleister Crowley, who very much is tied into these satanic streams. Not exclusively, because there's some people that are interested in his writings, and it's fairly innocuous. They're just eclectic. But if you get into the deeper levels of this satanic impulse, then you'll find that Aleister Crowley plays a prominent role in carrying the Sabbatian impulse forward, and that you'll meet plenty of people that, well, if you go into that, it's like the deeper levels, when you get into it, you have a choice. Do you serve the powers of good, or are you on a quest for power? Then you serve the powers of darkness. And you can read, really in the writings of Paul, we wage war not against men, but against principalities and powers. So whether or not one believes that it's the case, the people that are into the dark side of this and the ritual satanic operations that happen, they believe it, and they believe they receive power, and they believe that the dark spirits that they serve, that the more terrified the individual is, that it's going to feed these dark powers. And in the vampire style rituals, that they feel that there's a greater hormonal content in the blood of somebody who's terrified. One of the delicacies in China, for example, is they torture dogs before they send them to be butchered, because they feel that that's, all the hormones that are released from torturing the animal is a very much stimulatory to your own biological processes. So there's this very, very perverse system going on amongst certain people. And you go to the movie that was made, Eyes Wide Shut, and you see that that's a real scenario. And so this is something very real that we're dealing with, because if you get into Jimmy Savile, for example, the famous BBC radio personality who was busted for pedophilia and necrophilia, he actually paid to have a wing built on a children's hospital so that he would have access to children's corpses for sexual reasons. It's just, I feel horrible even bringing it up, but since that's what we're doing here, it's necessary to stare reality right in the face. Now, if you go into Christian culture, you see that before the crucifixion, the Last Supper occurred, and he gave the bread and the wine, and he said, "Do this in memory of me." So the attitude of sacrifice was lifted away from sacrificing bulls or sheep or what have you, or even people. It was sanctified in the Eucharist so that this sacrifice could be redeemed without the unnecessary suffering, that the earth was cleansed of that. But of course, not everybody has taken up that impulse.
You have so hit that on the point, because really, in the Eucharist, in the Christian, Catholic, or any Eucharist, it's often said that the blood or the wine represents the blood of Christ, and the host, the bread, represents his body. So are we being cannibals, eating the body and drinking the blood of Jesus Christ, Jesus of Nazareth? Are we like the rich people who right now, their obsession, all the rich people are doing this, they have transfusions with younger people, teenagers, because it, in fact, restores your blood. And as you pointed out, there's all these blood mysteries, even drinking the blood. And so we're in the Eucharist, you're drinking the blood of a god, really. So I would like to look at that a little bit different. I think that with the oligarchs and with the church, they have these blood mysteries that have a lot to do with the past and with the 7 deadly sins in the present. But if you are not participating in the 7 deadly sins, it's almost unimaginable for you to think about what John and I are speaking about. It's if you actually understood it, because when we wrote the Anonymous Patriot article on what was really happening with the slave trade in the world and how dramatic those numbers were, adult men wrote in and said that it made them cry, and that it took them a long time to get over it. Because these are very sad statistics going on now. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is not speculation. We're talking about whether you turn the circumambulation of the Kaaba during the Hajj recently in Mecca. 45 people died. Every year that this happens, people are trampled to death, usually women and children. There are human sacrifices still going on to this day. When we send our troops to Afghanistan, to Iraq, to Syria, any place in the world where we put their lives on the line, that's human sacrifice. We do it for the idea of the fact that in perpetuity, freedom and democracy are going to be continued, and it's going to be alive in America and spreading throughout the country. These are what our soldiers are told, having been a soldier myself. It is not far from human sacrifice to see what human suffering happened in Sudan under Obama's term with Susan Rice. It's not far from human sacrifice to see what we did to Iraq when George Bush Sr. decided to attack Iraq based upon a UN resolution based upon lies. Again, George Bush Jr., how many people died there? How many people died in the World Trade Center? We know that Dick Cheney was in charge of those 3 war games going on that day, and some would say that he's 100% culpable for the death of those 2,977 people. Was that human sacrifice? I'm not so sure that right or left, that we're far away from that. You see the KKK and white supremacists come out, and they're ready to fight Black Lives Matter and Antifa. They're ready to kill each other. So how far are we from being animals? Have we really progressed since the days when we tried to appease the gods by making human sacrifices? Here's what I think. I think that, just as you pointed out, John, in really the Eucharist, that is a representation of the present human being. Each human being is sacrificing their own body and blood for the sake of something spiritual, that reconnection. We don't need a priest. We don't need a Catholic Church. We don't need a monarchy. We don't need anyone to tell us what to do or be or arbitrate for us or be the middleman. We directly look at our own. There's a war going on in your own blood, and that war is going on between the big pharma companies, big pharmaceutical, the FDA, Monsanto, and also against your body. There's a war going on against your body. There's a war going on against your soul and your spirit. But we do not have to listen. We are the third estate, and we are the fourth estate. We do not have to believe what our national leaders tell us or our politicians. We do not have to believe what the church tells us, what Pope Francis or the head of any religion tells us. We are a church of one, and we can look at our own Eucharist, our own development of consciousness, because that's what those rituals were developed for. It was to develop the faith to believe that we live beyond death. And so what do those who are scared of death, who are in alignment with the devil, do? They use death to intimidate people. How many people are intimidated by Barack Obama? If you lived in one of the 7 countries he bombed, are you intimidated by him? What do you think of him? Do you think he works for the devil, or do you think he works for God? So I think it's happening every single moment. It's happening on the global level, the national level, in every single country. It's happening on the religious level. It's happening with every person. But I do believe that the element here is all about human sacrifice. Can you sacrifice yourself, your own self, and be selfless and not be selfish? And that's what I said was driving, in my opinion, most of the greed and most of these people. I'm not sure they have any deal with the devil. I think many of them don't know the devil exists and that they're the handmaiden, they're the tool of the devil, and that they don't know the devil exists. Therefore, they don't stand up to the devil because they also don't know that good exists. They are terrified of death. I imagine certain people in Washington in my mind right now who are 100% terrified of death. And so what do? They perpetrate it on others. And by having that authority and control and power and manipulation over other people, it makes them feel powerful when they actually are weak little mice because they are afraid of death. They don't even understand reincarnation. They don't understand that they may go from life to life, or that there's life after death, or any of those ideas. They don't get that. And so I'm not sure they've done deals with the devil, but I do believe that they have become the devil themselves in some cases because of their ignorance and because of the vacuity in their soul has allowed for such forces to come in. And those forces are not unprecedented in history. So in a sense, all these oligarchs, all these imperialistic corporate people that go out and do these murderous things, and they do it with impunity, they do it without conscience, I have to assume that if they didn't make a deal with the devil, they've become the devil's tool. And it's a very, very sad situation we're in, but it is consciousness that changed religions from human sacrifice. It is consciousness that stopped wars. It is consciousness that developed ideologies that gave us social democracy and republics that were not oligarchies, that were not just based upon theocracies. So it is the human consciousness. Every individual person homeopathically can affect the whole world by what it is that they do themselves. So we see now people creating lawsuits, one after the next, completely taking down elements of the deep state. We see people standing up for morality. We see people standing up against even Francis. He's had attack after attack within his own church saying, what you are saying is wrong. This is not your domain. Get out of your social Marxist attitude and stop telling countries what to do. So we don't have to listen to churches anymore. We have to listen to our own conscience. And I believe that when one listens to one's conscience, that you will hear that which is angelic when you're thinking of what a higher human being can be. But for others, all they hear is the animalistic calls of wolves and of badgers and of jackals, because that's what they become in their service to the devil. Or at least that's my opinion, John.
Yes, I think that's really true. And really, if you look at the current state of affairs in Europe with the EU, it's really kind of startling within the context of our conversation today, because if you look in the leadership within the EU, you find that there's just a tremendous number of people that don't have any children. They have no stake in the future. President of France, Emmanuel Macron, he has no children. Angela Merkel, Chancellor of Germany, she hasn't. Theresa May in the UK, she doesn't have children. The Prime Minister of Italy, Paolo Gentiloni, he doesn't have children. The Prime Minister of Netherlands, Mark Rutte. Prime Minister of Sweden, Stefan Löfven. The Prime Minister of Luxembourg, Xavier Bettel. Prime Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon. President of Lithuania, Dalia Grybauskaitė. the president of Romania, Klaus Iohannis, the president of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, and we can include Pope Francis. None of these people have children. So they have no stake in the future. So we have to question, and I'm not accusing any of them specifically of these types of things. It's just really curious that we have these leadership that have no stake in the future. And so consequently, this was brought up by Phil Lawler, the editor of the Catholic World News. And he said, so a grossly disproportionate number of the people making decisions about Europe's future have no direct personal stake in that future. And so in ending to this, I have to quote the poet Novalis, where the children are, there is the golden age.